Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Colin Lugton, the immediate past chairman of Malhamdale Local History Group. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all this evening to this unique meeting about our special person, Walter Morrison, which is coming to you from the Memorial Library of Biggleswick School. Now, we have a brilliant audience this evening, brilliant attendance, which I think is going to be a record for any MLHG meeting. And we have a very distinguished audience this evening. But I'm not allowed to tell you any names. But I can tell you that we have some guests, I think, coming from Morrison town in Argentina. So in my best South American Spanish, hola, nuestros amigos argentinos, bienvenido. Now, today is a special day. Not only is the year 2021 the centenary of Walter Morrison's death, today, which is the 21st of May, was Walter Morrison's birthday. So happy birthday, Walter. We've been thinking and talking about this project for a few years. And fortunately, about a year ago, we teamed up with the Museum of North Craven Life at the Folly in Settle. And they have taken the lead role. They have been taking the lead role in planning, fundraising, coordinating, marketing, and organising the Walter Morrison Festival. I'm actually referring to Heather Lane and Caitlin Greenwood. Heather is the chair of the trustees of the North Craven Building Preservation Trust and honorary curator of the Museum of North Craven Life at the Folly in Settle. Heather has chaired our festival committee meetings and led on fundraising and various other aspects. Caitlin Greenwood is the Heritage Development Officer at the Folly, and Caitlin has been the project manager for the Walter Morrison Festival. They've both done a brilliant job in a very difficult year. Without them, we would not have the Walter Morrison Festival. So that's enough for me. It's my privilege now to introduce Heather Lane, who is going to tell us some more about the Walter Morrison Festival and to introduce our top class speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first event of the Walter Morrison Festival, which is going to be running through until late December. We have a variety of talks, walks, and exhibitions in venues across the district of Craven. It's been a great pleasure for the Museum of North Craven Life to have the opportunity to work with so many organisations on this local history festival. With the pandemic as a spur, we've decided to make the landscape that Walter Morrison loved our focus and to encourage visitors to visit 6 mini exhibitions as they explore this beautiful corner of the Yorkshire Dales. The Walter Morrison Way, a new long-distance footpath, will launch later in the summer, and we hope that as many people as possible will try it out. The 6 exhibitions open from tomorrow morning. Each one introduces you to Morrison and an aspect of his life and career. Each one is different, and you can visit them in any order. Full details of the opening times can be found on the festival pages on the Folly's website. Can I just remind you, first of all, of some Zoom etiquette for this evening. Please remain muted. and we are already recording this session. You may want to switch to speaker view, and if you have any problems or would like to pose a question to this evening's speaker, please put comments into the chat. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Robin Bundy. Robin has a degree in chemistry and worked as an industrial chemist in the plastics industry. Although he confesses that he has no background in history, local or otherwise, he's always had an interest in historic buildings and heritage. His late wife Rosemary joined MLHG at its inception 30 years ago, and Robin began to attend as work allowed, becoming more and more interested in local history. He first led a group to research the history of education in Malhamdale, the results of which are on the MLHG website. He's been treasurer and chairman of MLHG and now holds the post of archivist, caring for a physical archive of 1,600 items, plus a digital archive of many thousand files relating to Malhamdale. He also cares for a large quantity of archival material relating to Craven Church and has represented the church on the festival organising group. We at the Museum of North Craven Life are particularly grateful for the huge amount of help that he has given to make the festival a reality. And I'd like to pay tribute to the co-organisers who have done so much over the past year to make this such a special year to come. We're looking forward tonight, Robin, to hearing more about the extraordinary life of the inspiration that Walter Morrison has given us for this festival. And I'd like to hand over now to Robin Bundy to tell us more about Walter Morrison, a man of many parts. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Heather. As has been said, on this day, May 21st, 1836, Walter Morrison was born. And I feel particularly honoured to be able to open this series of events to commemorate the centenary of his death in December 1921. The talk is based very largely on research done 15 or so years ago by my late wife, Rosemary, together with Barbara Anderson, on behalf of Malhamdale Local History Group. They first gave their version of this talk in Malham Town House, and the second time they gave it in the chapel here at Gigglewood School. So this is quite an emotional event for me. So let's make a start. I'll just have to share screen. Right, sorry, that took a moment or two. So here is the great man, a man of many parts, as my late wife called him. I already had far more material for the talk before so much more came to light in preparing for this festival. So I had great difficulty in deciding not what to put in, but what to leave out. I want to start by looking into his family background to see what influences helped to shape him, his ideals, and to see what influences helped to shape him, his ideals and his principles, and also what gave him the resources to pursue his many interests. Let's start with his parents. His father, James, was born in 1789, and he was the second of 4 children of a publican father living at the George Inn at Middle Wallet, which was on the coaching route between Salisbury and London. All 4 of his children received an education, but when James was a teenager, both of his parents died, and within a year, that happened within a year of one another. And what happened to James over the next few years is somewhat uncertain, but we do know that he was in London a few years later working for a man called Sunshine Todd in his haberdashery warehouse. Right, I'll get used to this before we come too far. So this is Sunshine Todd. And Walter worked hard and he showed quite a bit of business acumen, and one could also say he had an eye for the main chance, because in a few years' time he had married the boss's daughter Mary and taken control of the firm. He worked on the basis of low prices and a quick turnover, and he was reputed to have been the first person to sell goods at 1/11 instead of 2 shillings. And he cornered the market in Black Craig shortly before the death of Queen Charlotte in 1818, knowing full well that he could cash in on the fashion for wearing black as mourning after the death of the monarch. He also made a fortune selling kid gloves, an item of dress essential at that time. And he went to Italy and wrote home to say, "I have all the Neapolitan skins under my thumb." He had, in fact, bought sufficient skins to make about 500,000 pairs. So here's Mary and James, his mother and father, and they had 11 children between 1817 and 1842, Walter being the 9th child and the 5th son. And by the time Walter was born in 1836, James was an extremely wealthy man. In 1830, he had bought this house, Fonthill House in Wiltshire. Just make a note in your minds of the tower there. And by 1838, James had also acquired Basildon Park, a large country mansion in the Palladian style, not far from the Thames in Berkshire. So, Walter's childhood was spent in very comfortable surroundings as part of this large family. James had paid £97,000 for Basildon Park, equivalent to about £8 million today. And the house is now Grade 1 listed and owned by the National Trust. And James was an art collector. He mixed with artists and inventors and thinkers of the day. So Walter grew up in a surrounded by beautiful things and interesting people. For education, Walter went to Eton and then to Balliol College, Oxford, where he read Greats. That's the study of ancient Rome and Greece and their languages and literature and philosophy. And he came away with a first-class degree that, according to his biographer Geoffrey Dawson, the then editor of the Times, he achieved with only 9 months of breeding. So a bright young man. He was also an excellent oarsman, and he wrote the Balliol of the Stroke. And throughout his life, he kept close contact with Eton and with Oxford. And as we'll see yet later, he was extremely generous to both institutions, especially to Oxford. As many young men of his time, he went on the Grand Tour, but he covered not only Europe, but Egypt, Syria, and the USA. And his travels in the Middle East led to a lifelong interest in the history and the archaeology of that area. And he became the honorary treasurer of the Palestine Exploration Fund from the year following its formation in 1865. And he was a member of the governing body of the PEF right through until 1919. And he was actively involved also in their expeditions and was a generous benefactor. And he gave the fund their premises in central London in 1911, and they occupied until 2019. And one of his donations to Oxford University was to set up a readership in Egyptology. He also gave 2 anonymous donations, which financed the British Museum's Kashmir excavations, £5,000 in 1912 and a further 10 in 1914, somewhere around £1.2 million today. So, with his education complete, Walter was ready to start the next stage of his long career. He was already a wealthy and well-travelled young man, and he had some quite radical views, but also a strong sense of his position in society and a sense of public duty. So, the age of 21 in 1857, Walter first appears in Craven, having been given the Malhamdale estate. In 1852, Lord Ribblesdale had sold the estate to James Morrison, Walter's father, and Walter became the owner when he became of age. This was small compared with Basildon and Fonthill, but after all, he was only the fifth son, wasn't he? For any of you who don't know, that doesn't appear on my screen now, we lost. No, right. Lost it. Any of you who don't know where Malhamdale House is, it's on the north side of Malhamdale, and it's now fixed for this centre. So, this is Malhamdale House as it would have been when we arrived there, but he proceeded to extend it by adding an east wing and a veranda and the Italianate bell tower, which was dismantled in about 1963, and you can't see it today. And this was similar to the one which his brother Alfred had built at Fonthill. You know, if you can have a tower, I can have one too, this was. So, although he divided his time between Malhamdale and the property in London, and later one he rented in Sydney, it was Malham that was his true home, and he referred to it as his mountain home. And the simplicity of life at Malham, and the ruggedness and harshness of the moors was what he enjoyed. He became involved in many, many aspects of local life. Sadly, in 1873, a serious fire occurred at the house, which left little more than the outer shell. Fortunately, the books and pictures were rescued, and rebuilding began almost straight away. Even when it was completed, the house furnishing was sparse, the place uncomfortable by modern standards, but it had large rooms, big windows, beautiful views, and best of all, peace and tranquility. There, he was surrounded by a loyal staff. There's one picture of some of them and another. Many of these grew old with him, and obviously they changed over the years, but for much of the time, William Skirrell was the butler at the London house in Cromwell Road, and he came up to Malham when needed. And Martha, his wife, was the housekeeper in London. Miss Bella Lodge was the housekeeper at Malham, and it was said that she acted like a lady when the master was away. Robert Battersby was the coachman, and just before the First World War, when a car was finally purchased, it was he who became the chauffeur. And the gamekeeper and the gardeners were locals, walking up from Malham, and some even walking up from Arnley. The estate generally is in the hands of this man, John Whittingdale Winslow, a smart, dapper man who dealt with the estate more or less single-handed. He was in charge of the shooting and the fishing, and Morrison was a reasonable shot, but we believe he wasn't particularly interested in the sport, although the annual grouse bag was usually well over 1,000. And when shooting parties were arranged, guests were expected to turn out whatever the weather. Walter is reputed to have locked up the billiard balls when the weather was bad, so there was no escaping the pouring rain and taking the soft option of the game of billiards. Fishing in the Tarn was excellent, and many of his guests and friends enjoyed the privilege of using the Tarn for sport. This is a fishing ticket and a letter accompanying it to his friend Thomas Bradshaw, and here is Bradshaw with a trout showing the size of some of the fish that came out of the Tarn. Walter never married. There have been some vague suggestions that he might have had a relationship with Gertrude Bell. They had a common interest in the Middle East, and her family were involved in the iron industry in the northeast of England, where Walter also had business interests. So it's very unlikely they would not have known one another. She also never married. Gertrude's and Walter's lives and interests overlapped, but perhaps there was just too big an age difference, or maybe they just didn't get on. But beside the shooting parties, luncheons and group visits, Walter was always pleased to entertain guests who stayed at the house, people with similar interests and with whom he could have conversations and a good exchange of ideas. Here he is addressing a group that came to the house, as many others did, And there he is standing on the grass outside Malham Tarn house, hat in hand. Among the visitors, Charles Kingsley is one of the best known, and his letters from Tarn house still exist. Kingsley was very taken with the area and its inhabitants, and he wrote, "The people are the finest I ever saw, tall, noble, laconic, often handsome, very musical too. The women have the sweetest voices in speech I have ever heard." But it was Malham Cove that impressed him with its dark markings, and he used the area as the inspiration for his famous book, The Water Babies. And he also found the fishing in the Tarn very good, and he described it as the best in the whole world. Walter's other famous visitors, among many, included Thomas Hughes, the author of Tom Brown's School Days, Charles Darwin, John Stuart Mill, the philosopher and political economist, John Ruskin, who stayed in Malham at the Buck Inn, and he painted this watercolour of one of the farms on the estate, Middle House. Tarn House was Walter Morrison's home for over 60 years. And he was interested in every part of the estate and every family who lived there. And being there such a long time, he got to know them and their children and so on. So he had a habit of visiting his tenants unannounced, which, although his motives were kindly, could have the effect of causing some panic at the farm. These were the days when the tenants knew their place in society. And when these visits occurred, the older children would often fade into the background, but Morrison invariably sat with the toddler on his knee in the kitchen. After the birth of one of her children, the wife of one of the farmers on the estate was proudly displaying her new daughter to Mr. Morrison, who said, "Oh, what a shame, better luck next time," a comment which hardly endeared him to the proud mother. Another visit to the same lady, it was actually Mrs. Carr, the wife of Stephen Carr at Park House, and when the landlord arrived unannounced, and he told her to carry on with her baking, he would just sit in the corner and be as quiet as a mouse. No doubt she was all fingers and thumbs with her pastry, being watched by him. When she had finally finished, he commented that he'd always wanted to know how the jam got into jam pasties. He built several new houses on the estate, and he also rebuilt the Buck Inn in Malham. And he used an architect from London, and this page from the accounts of the Malham Tarn house shows something like £300 being spent on Middle House Farm in 1873. Yet, in the next 10 or 15 years, a new Middle House farm was built just a short distance away in typical Morrison style. And this style, with these steep roofs, quite out of character with most traditional Dale houses, is now quite a feature of the Malham Moor area. One farmer mentioning to Morrison that he couldn't see out the window of his new house when he was sitting down was told by Walter, "A farmer should get up and go out, not sit and look out." I suppose that stirred the farmer into some action. Morrison was a great walker, and he could be seen striding around the estate and up and down the hill from Settle. And when he arrived from London by train, he would walk up from Belbus to near the station, or perhaps from Settle, and which is quite a steep pull, certainly from the Settle side. On Sundays, all the household staff will be expected to go to church in Kirby Malham, quite a good walk. And the staff members walked down to church but were allowed to ride back on, whereas Morrison himself preferred to walk. Now, although he was wealthy, he was very careful with money and he inspected all the estate account. If a sheep died, then that was debited from the accounts, but if they got any money from the fleece, that was credited back in again. He wanted to count every penny. So his interest spread far and wide in the district, and his name can be found as a subscriber to many, many different groups in the district. For example, he was a member of the Settle Cave Exploration Society, which was formed in 1869 to carry out large-scale and systematic investigation of Victoria Cave, that had been discovered in 1837, just a year after his birth. In 1975, however, a surprising discovery was made. A hole found under a flagstone by the kitchen window at Darnbrook Farm proved to be a pothole a mile long. Exploration of this by David Hodgson led to a chamber where 7 names and dates were found scratched into the rock. And amongst them was W. Morrison, 1867. He'd been there over 100 years before. It's impossible in one talk to mention all the organisations with which he had a connection. And although business and parliamentary duties took him away from the estate a great deal, he was in no way an absentee landlord, and he liked nothing better than to return to his mountain home as often as he could. I'll move now on to Walter the politician. Walter's father, James, had represented St Ives, Ipswich, and Inverness burghs as an MP between 1830 and 47. So the precedent for Walter to enter Parliament was really set. And at 25, he contested Plymouth as a Liberal, and he won, and he held the seat until 1874, when he lost to the Conservatives. He stood for the City of London in 1880 as a Liberal, but he didn't get in that time. By 1886, now age 50, he was firmly established in Craven. And when Gladstone introduced his first Home Rule Bill for Ireland and went to the country over it, Morrison strongly disagreed. He disagreed with the Home Rule project for many, many years. So Morrison disagreed, and he broke with the Liberal Party, and he became a Liberal Unionist. And he was persuaded now to stand as the MP for Skipton in the 1886 election, where he defeated Sir Matthew Wilson, the Liberal candidate, by 134 votes, a remarkable and very unexpected victory. The seat had only been created in 1885, and Matthew Wilson, a well-known local person, held it for less than 8 months. 6 years later, in 1892, the main issue was still Home Rule for Ireland, and Morrison was still strongly against it, but this time he was beaten by Mr. Roundell. Then, in June of 1882, problems arose which ended when he went to court in 1894. Now, the background of the case began when the West Yorkshire Pioneer of Skipton, a newspaper that supported the Liberals, published a letter which was signed Ribble Head, making a serious charge that by his investments in railways in Argentina, Walter was helping to lower the value of grain and meat by aiding the import of these products to the UK. And he was therefore helping to impoverish his own tenants. It went on to cite the case of Christopher Metcalfe of Middle House, the farm that we've just seen, on Malham Moor, who Ribblehead alleged to have been forced out of his home by Morrison. This was strenuously denied by Walker and supported by Mr. Metcalfe himself, who said Morrison had nothing to do with his decision to sell it. He owed no money to Walker, and it was the bank who forced the situation. He was actually still living in Middle House with Morrison's permission. The Pioneer refused to make an apology and also to identify Ribblehead, and the implication was that the letter had been written in-house to damage Walker's reputation. A further allegation actually precipitated the court case. William Harbert Dawson, the editor of the Pioneer, maliciously wrote in the Farmer's column that at the rent audit of his tenants, despite there being only a slight improvement in agriculture, Morrison had made a rent remission of only 5% the coming year, when he had regularly given a remission of 25% when he was an MP. The implication was that the high rent rebates had just been given to bribe votes from his tenants. This was untrue. The figure was 10%, not 5%, and it was on top of, not instead of, the remissions given in previous years. If, for example, the rent at Middle House had been 618 before Christopher Metcalfe had taken over the tenancy. This had been reduced to 400 when Metcalfe took it, and by the time he sold it, it was down to 217. The editor, it was alleged, knew of the error before going to press, but published it anyway, with an insignificant correction tucked away in small print. And when no suitable apology came, the case went to the High Court in London. And Morrison won with damages of £250 against Dawson and £250 against Edmondson, the printer. In fact, Walter appears to have been a very fair and considerate landlord to his tenants, and his rental audits held in the list of arms in Malham, although no doubt businesslike, were clearly quite social affairs. If this page from the ledgers of the list of arms in Malham show, I'll just bring that up. You can probably read that now. You can see here, this is the rent audit, a bottle of brandy, 16 dinners, 2 bottles of whiskey, half a gallon of ale, a bottle of gin, tobacco and cider, and cigars. So quite a sociable event. The following year, in 1895, Morrison stood again for Skipton as a unionist. This time he won by 139 votes, defeating James Anson Farrer from England. But in 1900, here's the flyer for that election, a very grand affair, printed in colour. Your interest, vote, and your vote and interest is respectfully solicited for Mr. Walter Morrison. In this case, his opponent was Frederick Thompson, who came from Halifax, but Thompson managed to charm the people of Skipton and won by 132 votes. So Walter then retired from political life at the age of 64, but he remained a loyal supporter of the Unionist Party in Skipton. He was never an ambitious politician. He was never an ambitious politician, and he never held any high office in government. He had principles which he stuck by. In his younger days, he'd been a staunch supporter of the cooperative movement and worked for improving working class housing, and he was an active supporter of votes for women as well. Right, can I carry on? It's worth noting that he held the Skipton seat for a total of 11 years, and he defeated Matthew Wilson, who had held the seat for only about 7 or 8 months. But whose statue stands in Skipton High Street? It's Matthew Wilson. But I suppose Walter couldn't take away the fact that Wilson was Skipton's first MP, and he also came from a local family. I'll move on now to what's going on here. It's not, doesn't seem to want to move on. Thank you. Here we are. So Walter the businessman. As we've seen, he was already a wealthy man when he inherited the estate at Malhamdale, and he spent a lifetime nurturing and extending these business interests. When he died, he shares in several hundred companies, but I'm only going to touch on a few of them tonight. One organisation which he was involved with for over 30 years was the Central Argentine Railways. His family owned shares in the company, and Walter was appointed their representative in 1874 and then took over as chairman in 1887. And he held this for about 20 years. He undertook a long visit to Argentina during this time, and under his chairmanship, the company expanded and the share capital rose. The railway was the main carrier of wheat and maize in the area, helping to open it up for exports, hence the ribblehead affair. He must have been well respected in Argentina because there are lasting memorials to him there. A town and a railway station on the former Central Argentine Railway in the province of Córdoba changed its name in 1907 from Zuberia to Morrison. And it's a very grand place with plenty of references to our Walter. And a street in Fisherton, a residential suburb of Rosario, was also named Morrison in his honour. Hand in hand with his chairmanship of the Central Argentine Railway, he was also involved with the Central Argentine Land Company. He had railway interests near to home as well. The Yorkshire Dales Railway had tried to get permission to build a line to Grassington and then take it through to Darlington, but it had repeatedly been refused. till eventually in 1897 we got approval to build as far as Threadfield. This is the scene at the cutting of the first sod, which took place in 1900. And Walter officiated. He's out the back with his ceremonial spade there. This was because the then chairman, Sir Matthew Wilson, was away at the time. By 1902, when the line was actually opened, Walter was chairman, and he had this position for many years. And the line opened up access into Walkdale, and it was important for the transportation of limestone as well as passengers, so obviously it still has today, of course. Another involvement he had locally was with the Craven Band. He was a director and he's then chairman of the Craven Band. Craven had its own band for many years with the well-known names of John Birkbeck and William Alcott among the first directors. It had been established here in Settle in 1791. And Walter joined as a director and became chairman in 1905, but he was to be the last chairman because the following year they amalgamated with the Bank of Liverpool, and this subsequently became Martin's Bank and eventually absorbed by Barclays. Needless to say, the Craven Bank and then the Bank of Liverpool were the bankers for the Yorkshire as well. And yet another company with which he had an interest for about 50 years was the Carlton Iron Company in Newtown-on-Tees. He joined this company in 1870 as a director, and he became chairman, yet another chairmanship in 1881. And over the years, the company bought coal mines and limestone mines and built coke ovens and furnaces, developing the business to such an extent that the small hamlet, originally called Stillington, became the centre of a large industrial complex with a population of nearly 1,000. And it became known as the village of the Carlton Ironworks. And in line with Walter's responsibility for the workforce, they built new housing and a school, a church, a chapel, and a working men's club. And he personally loaned and gave money to the company to keep it afloat on many occasions when the industry suffered slumps and depressions, knowing that if it collapsed, it would have thrown so many men out of work. In spite of this, by 1920, the company could no longer be propped up and it was taken over by Dorman Long. This is... Sorry, I'm not getting it to move again, Kate. Here we are. I'm not getting it to move again. Sorry. This is Morrison Street in Stillington. And then there was another street named after him, Morrison Terrace, with the little open all hours type shop on the corner there. The heap of slag behind these houses, which eventually covered 30 acres, didn't make it a great place to live, but it was eventually removed and it was eventually used as hardcore for the A1M. On a very small scale by comparison, he was chairman of a new venture in the 1880s to raise capital of £3,000 to buy the commercial hotel in Settle. This was formerly the Joiners Arms, and they wanted to turn it into a temperance hotel and a coffee tavern. So whether the business was small or large, Walter Morrison operated with the same conscientiousness. He attended the business meetings wherever possible, and he took his responsibilities very seriously. He attended nearly all the board meetings of the Carlton Iron Company. He had a reputation for straight and honest dealing, and at his death, he had a huge amount of money in stocks and shares, 54% being in Britain and 16% in Latin America and others elsewhere. His wealth had also increased by the death of his brother and sister, leaving Walter with part of their fortunes to add to his own. I'll move on now to his connection with the military. You can see he certainly is a man of many parts. And this was totally in keeping with his beliefs in patriotism and loyalty. He believed in the defence of the nation. And in later years, one of his favourite hobbies was the study of military campaigns. After taking over the Malhamdale estate, one of his first involvements was the formation of the North Craven Volunteers. In 1859, when tension was running high between Britain and France and hostilities looked likely, The Secretary of State for War had contacted Lord Lieutenants of the counties, allowing them to form volunteer rifle corps. And in Settle, an inaugural meeting was held in 1859 at the Settle Courthouse. And this resulted in the formation of the North Craven Rifles. And Walter Morrison and John Becker, alongside him, were secretaries. And I don't suppose you can see this, but this is the list of the people attending the inaugural meeting. And there at the bottom arrow is Walter Morrison. Volunteers were expected to pay for all or at least part of their equipment, and it cost £3.8 for a rifle and £2 1 for the uniform. And other expenses would be borne by subscriptions from the honorary members. Under Walter's auspices, the group grew very quickly. By the end of the year, there were about 40 active members and a band of 16 players, and Walter was appointed lieutenant. And by 1860, the rifle range at Attermire had been built on Walter's land, the remains of which can still be seen today. I hope if you go on the Walter Morrison walk later in the summer, you have a good look at this when you pass, because there are still the target plates there. This one's got a date of 1860 on it. And it was used for target practice and for competitions right up to the end of the outbreak of war in 1914. It was a Malham Tarn house, however, that there was a venue for a shooting match in 1860 with the Settle, Ingleton and Skipton groups competing for a silver bugle donated by Walter Morrison. It must have been a wonderful sight. 60 men from Skipton marching with their band from Belbus Station. They were joined by 40 men from Settle with their band and with the competitors from Ingleton, all in the grey and scarlet uniforms. They made their way up on foot to Malham Tarn House, and Walter was the host, and he provided the venue, the prizes, the lunch and the tea. And he must have been very proud that the North Craven marksman won the bugle. Drills were held twice a week, and they were at first in the Joiners' Arms until he paid for the building of the drill hall in Settle for practice and as a social meeting place. Walter went on to be the Major Commandant, and in 1865, Lieutenant Colonel. And he even went to the School of Musketry at Hythe for instruction in order to better fill his role. And here he is as Lieutenant of the North Craven Rifles in his uniform at the School of Musketry. And he passed on his command in 1867, but he remained an honorary member throughout his life. The Volunteer Corps existed for about 49 years, and it became a popular institution in the locality with these shooting matches a regular event. But in 1908, they ceased to exist, and they were reformed as the Territorials, who were mobilised at the outbreak of World War I. If you look in the Settle Chronicle about those times, there are ever so many social events that are organised by the volunteers and for the volunteers. Anyway, the outbreak of World War I, Morrison was again at the forefront of benefactors, and he gave £1,000 to equip the regiment with socks, shirts and boots ready for service. And despite being nearly 80 and not in good health, he worked tirelessly throughout the war. He attended war charity sales, recruited meetings, fundraising events for hospitals. In fact, anywhere where he felt his presence was needed and would be helpful. And his donations were always prompt and large. He was doing his duty in the only way that he was then able. By the end, this is a poster for a fundraising event, and it's the passing over of a captured machine gun, and it's going to be received by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Morrison in the marketplace in Settle. By the end of the war, his health had deteriorated, but he gave one final gift as a thank you from the Skipton Parliamentary Division for all who had answered the call of duty. The gift took the form of a book entitled Craven's Part in the Great War, which was to be presented to every ex-serviceman in the district or to the family in the case of men who had been killed. And the material was compiled by John Craven, who was the editor of the Craven Herald. And each area had its own presentation of the books, and the one from Malhamdale took place on September the 24th, 1921. And here's the poster advertising this, saying that it's going to be presented outside the church hall in Kirby Malham, the church hall where one of our mini exhibitions is being held as from tomorrow. Walter wasn't expected to turn up because of his health, but very unexpectedly, word got around that he was going to come to make the presentations. But he was too frail to get out of his car. And this, as it happened, turned out to be his last public appearance, as he died in December of that year. It seemed somehow quite fitting that it should be his last pass, thanking the men in the Dale he loved for fighting for the country he loved. Walter the Benefactor. So what did Walter Morrison do with all the wealth he had accumulated? He lived a simple life at Malham Tarn. Malham Tarn house was very modest for a man of his means. He was, of course, incredibly generous, giving money to an enormous variety of causes. He hated publicity, and many of his donations were made anonymously, and they only came to light after his death. We've already seen, or I've already mentioned, how generous he was to all war-related charities, especially during the Great War, and of his lifelong support to the Palestine Exploration Fund and of archaeology in the Middle East. But here we have Kirby Malham Church. Kirby Malham Church benefited enormously from his gifts. He was patron of the church. This came as being sort of Lord of the Manor when his father gave him the Malham Tarn house estate, because this had passed down after the Reformation through various families to Lord Ribblesdale and then to the Morrisons. So in 1866, he restored the building that we now know as the vicarage for the incumbent there at a very nominal rent. I'm hoping that our new priest for Kirby Malham is listening tonight, and she's shortly going to move into this very building that Walter Morrison renovated in 1866. By 1879, it was necessary to undertake a huge restoration of the church. Some sections of the wall were nearly collapsed. It was said that you could get your hand and half your arm into the cracks in some parts of the south wall. And this was the interior after restoration, and the total cost of which was about £4,300, of which Walter Morrison paid half. But in addition to that, he also provided a new organ, reredos, and tower screens to complete the project. The old Jacobean pews in the church were kept, but the chancel was shortened, choir stalls were added, and 3 new pews were added at the front of the church. The front one on the south side was Walter Morrison's pew, and here it is with his initials on it and the date 1818 when the restoration was carried out. We're grateful today that he insisted that the character of the church was retained and it wasn't Victorianized as so many old churches were. Another area of his life which he felt passionately about was education, and education at all levels, not just university and public schools. In Malhamdale, he was totally responsible for the building of 2 schools. This is Kirby Malham United School, the building that many people in Malhamdale will know and recognise, or it's only been slightly altered. And this was to replace the Kirby Malham Free Grammar School, which was situated close to the church in Kirby Malham, and Malham Grammar School, which was at the bottom of Malham Ings, and both of which were inadequately funded and below standard. They were both endowed institutions, and the money from the endowments really wasn't sufficient in those times. So he provided the site and paid the cost of the building, the new school, and the schoolhouse, an adjoining schoolhouse for the master. And the cost was £2,874, 3 shillings and 10.5 pence, which are detailed in the Malham estate account books down to the last halfpenny. He was chairman of the government of that school for nearly 50 years, and he took an enormous interest in all school affairs. The second school in Malhamdale was this one, Malham Moor School. This was built at the same time in 1874, and it was a small one at Malham Tarn to serve the children from Malham Moor. And once again, he was always active in its management, and in addition, he provided Christmas parties and other events for children. He was always in the forefront of the list of benefactors for Eton and Oxford. One example being his generosity to his old, one example of his generosity to his old college caused a bit of a stir. The old chapel at Balliol had been rebuilt. This happened in 1858, and it was a building designed by William Butterfield, and this is the new building. Morrison didn't like the design, and most people very much disliked the east window as well. And so when it was suggested in 1911 that the window should be replaced with one made from glass that had been saved from the original chapel, Walter Morrison suggested that they should be much bolder and they should demolish the whole of the new building and replace it with a replica of the 16th century chapel. And he offered £20,000 for the project, which was accepted, and it looked as if it might be going to go ahead. However, there was a group of old members and fellows who got together who thought that this was a huge waste of money and resources that could be better used elsewhere. So the idea was rejected. The money was returned to Walter, and it was said that he did not hide his irritation at this happening. However, this experience didn't stop his generosity. He subsequently gave £30,000 to the university, 10 for the readership in Egyptology I mentioned earlier, 10 for a professorial pension scheme, and 10 for the study of agriculture. And this was followed in 1920 by a huge donation of £50,000 to the Bodleian Library. I thought the biggest donation they'd ever received at that time. Near to home, in Yorkshire, he gave £10,000 to a new agricultural school at Leeds. He'd got a close relationship with Leeds University, being a member of the court. The other education establishment for which he was associated for 60 years was the one where we are tonight, at his Giggleswich School. He was a governor for all of that time and chairman of the governors twice, and he took a very detailed interest in all its affairs. Even when he was unable to attend meetings because of his political or other commitments, he always wrote detailed letters expressing his views on items on the agenda. At the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the governors and the headmaster were debating how they could commemorate the event. And Morrison came up with the offer to build a chapel, totally at his own expense, the one which is now such a well-known landmark. Here it is. He wanted it to be something of an architectural experiment. He wanted a Gothic building, but it was to incorporate a copper dome to give it an Eastern influence in line with his interest in the Middle East. It had, however, to appear natural in its surroundings, and the architect, T.G. Jackson, rose to this challenge, and the site was chosen on a rocky outcrop above the school, and work commenced in that year. It was completed 4 years later. No problem with long investigations and planning permission at that time. So no expense was spared. Walter insisted the very best craftsmen and materials were used from all around the world. All the wood was cedar and was imported from Argentina. And I've noticed if you go into the chapel today, if it's been closed for a while, you can just smell the cedar wood. Or at least I always sniff to see if I can smell it, and it seems to be still there in the air. But the marbles that we used came from Greece, Italy, Ireland, and Belgium, all of the best quality. This was a drawing of the interior as it looks to be, or as it was in those days, and this is it as it is now. Not only was the building to his specifications, as I say, but the whole of the internal fittings, the decoration, the furniture, and the ornamentation were his choice. It was said that that was to be that way so that no one at a future date would need to add anything at all, and particularly anything that he might not have approved of. The total cost was somewhere around £30,000, although in his obituary, Geoffrey Dawson gives a figure of 50,000, but I think the 30,000 is more accurate. The window in the south transept shows one of his few memorials, a figure of him holding the model of the chapel. At the same time as the chapel was built, the architect also designed a gatehouse with a lodge, a cricket pavilion, and these were all paid for by Morrison. There's a permanent memorial to him in the school, close to where I am speaking tonight, and this is a portrait of him, which was made by Professor von Herkener, and it was unveiled in 1903. And as I say, it still hangs above the staircase just outside this library. So these then are just a few of his significant gifts through a variety of causes, but there were literally hundreds of them. Some were small by comparison, but just as important to the beneficiaries, such as gifts of books for the Kirby Malham Reading Room, £50 for this cause, £10 for another. And over the years, they must have amounted to a very significant sum. Many of the larger gifts were given towards the end of his life, the book Craven's Part in the Great War being the last. And he died on Sunday, December the 18th, 1921 at Sidmouth in Devon at the age of 85. At his request, he was brought back to Kirby Malham, and his funeral was held at Kirby Malham Church, conducted by the then Vicar, the Reverend Baron, and with an address given by Sir Walter Sadler, who was Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University. And it was a huge affair with representatives from all the areas of his life, his family, his political life, local dignitaries, members of his staff, people off the estate, and representatives from many of the organisations that he'd been connected with. Even the children from Kirby Malham School who lined the path there, they were there to see the great man laid to rest. After his death, his gross wealth was valued at about £2 million. The Mount Tarn estate was left to his nephew, Major James Archibald Morrison, but he was also extremely generous to his faithful staff. The money that was left to his staff, even these days, I think would be regarded as quite large without thinking of the inflation. You know, there were 5,000 to 1, 1,000 to 1 of these sorts of figures. And after all of these bequests to other relatives, the residue went to his other nephew, Hugh Morrison, MP. So, how can I sum up the life of the grand old man of Craven? He was born to great wealth, but although he was never really self-indulgent, and as we've seen, he was extremely generous with both his money and his time. He was referred to as a big man, both physically large and large of character. He was unambitious, and other than being an MP, he held no public office and he had no title. The only honour he accepted was a Doctor of Civil Law from his own university. He had a deep love of Craven, and especially of Malhamdale with its limestone hills and its wild places, which he loved to show off to his visitors. If I can make any slightly adverse comment about him, he did have a touch of arrogance about him, I think, that he wanted things his way. If he was going to pay much of the money for Kirby Malham Church to be restored, he wanted the old characteristic of the church and the old character of the church retained. If he didn't like the chapel at Balliol and he had the money to pay for it to be knocked down and completely rebuilt, he would put it forward. But you know, he was a man who was able to do things and he wanted them doing in what he thought was the best way. Above all, he was a man of principles, with a strong sense of duty and of public service, and he was a patriot through and through. This is the memorial by which I like to remember him. His very plain gravestone in Kirby Malham churchyard. But there are many other memorials, some unrecognised, and many which I hope you'll see and learn about during our commemorative festival during the rest of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk, Robin. Would you stop sharing your screen now and people can see the beautiful backdrop a little bit better?
Right.
And I'm going to, as kind of chair of questions, if you'd like to put your questions in the chat for Robin, but I'm going to sneak in there first. And I'm going to say, Robin, what do you think Walter Morrison would have made about this idea of people doing a festival to celebrate him? Would he have liked it? Would he have not liked it? What do you reckon?
I don't know. I sort of think he would be quite embarrassed about it. You know, maybe secretly he would feel gratified that all he'd done and the impression he'd made on the district was now being recognised. But I just imagine him being embarrassed. He'd probably stay at home up in Malhamdale house and look out the window at the view and let it all go on around him, I guess. But who knows? I don't know.
That's great, thank you. So we have a question from Martin Levy, who says, thank you for such an interesting talk. You mentioned the 1866 vicarage for Kirby Malham, and he's wondering, do we know who the architect was for that building?
Well, the building itself goes back to around 1500. It was either built or rebuilt by the vicar of that time, who was King, Roger King. Well, King's definitely the surname. I think it was Roger King, and he built that vicarage for his own, built it for his own use, and we think it was probably a rebuild of an earlier building there, and it had stood and got passed into other hands and was part of the estate. There had been another building in the village used as a vicarage that was mentioned in some of the church terriers, but we don't know exactly which building it was. So it was a restoration of an existing building. So I don't know whether an architect was involved or it was done by his own people from the estate.
Okay, so that one remains a little mysterious. Okay, great. We have another question from Ken, who says, do you know if there were any Morrison family links to slavery? That's a very, very timely question with the anniversary of George Floyd's death coming up.
Yes, well, we do know, but there weren't. Of course, there was the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in, was it 1807, and the abolition of slavery in 1833, both of which just applied to the UK and the Empire or the colonies at that time. And James's father, as a publican, probably didn't have any financial interest much apart from the pub. So from a time point of view, it's difficult to think that they would have had any involvement in slavery or the slave trade. And all research into their financial assets show that there was no connection with slavery that we can find. And certainly Walter himself, I mean, he wasn't born until after the Abolition of Slavery Act had gone through, and what we know of him as a social reformer, somebody who was keen on votes for women, good housing for the working class and so on. I can't imagine he would have had any truck at all with slavery, and we definitely can't find any.
Okay, and we've had another comment. It's not a question, but it's Carolina who says, greetings from Argentina. So I think Carolina must be one of our Morrison town inhabitants who's joining us this evening. So hello from Yorkshire. I bet the weather's nicer in Argentina than it is here.
Yes, well, Carolina or Carolina, I don't know which is the right pronunciation. She's an English teacher in Morrison town, and she was very helpful to my wife Rosemary when she was doing her research. And it's great that you're able to join us tonight, Caroline.
Yeah, and I think that might be it for questions, unless anybody's furiously typing and wants to squeeze one in. So perhaps we want to hand back to Colin to... Aren't
you going to ask me what his favourite colour was?
I can do, Robin. What was Walter Morrison's favourite colour?
We think it might have changed over the years, don't we, Caitlin? It's said that Walter had all his crockery in Malhamdale house in yellow when he was a Liberal, and then when he moved to become more conservative in older age, he changed it all to blue, and they had the yellow crockery disposed of. So we think it might, in his early years, have been yellow, and in his later years, blue. That was a setup, wasn't it?
Okay, well, there aren't any questions, so perhaps Colin would like to come up and just say a few words in closing.
Yes, thank you, Robin. Thank you for your brilliant talk, very comprehensive and some wonderful slides, excellent. It's very difficult to summarise Walter's life in such a short period of time. Also, thank you to Giggleswick School for accommodating us this evening. Thank you to Heather for telling us a little bit about the Walter Morrison Festival. And of course, thank you to Caitlin for managing the technology this evening. Now, we look forward to seeing you all again, whether that is perhaps in one of our many exhibitions, or perhaps at another one of the talks or lectures, or perhaps even walking the Walter Morrison Way. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I wish you a very enjoyable rest of the evening. Thank you very much.